everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Pretend Pros. I am one of your co-hosts, Jenny Hoffman, the rookie.
I'm Beth Painter. I'm the other co-host. I am the IU fan. And as has happened quite a bit, that will actually be relevant in this conversation. So we're excited to be talking to Randy Smith today. Randy is a good friend of my dad, so that's how I know Randy. He had a career in sales, but obviously we're not here to talk about that because this is a sports podcast. So Randy also was a college football referee and then ended up in the video replay booth towards the end of his time as a ref. And so that is what we're here to talk about. So welcome to the podcast, Randy.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. And so in addition, as I mentioned, the other thing Randy and I have in common with, which is Jenny's favorite thing for me to talk about, is Randy is also an IU alum. So that is pretty much coincidence because he's a friend of my dad's, which is how I know him, not necessarily through IU. So Randy, I was trying to do the math on when you were at IU. Was it like early 70s? Did I get that close to right?
Yes. I started in 69. So I saw the beginning of the Bob Knight era. Fraternity brother was Kim Pemberton, who was one of Bobby Knight's first recruits. He wasn't a big time player, but so through that era, yeah.
Okay. So you just missed the game where IU played against O.J. Simpson, but would have probably already been a fan at that stage? Was that 67 when that happened?
Full disclosure, I was a huge Purdue fan. All of my friends from high school were going to Indiana, and so I just tagged along. I'd been to a bucket game with a friend of mine's dad and was rooting for Purdue at IU. So yeah, I grew into becoming an Indiana fan.
That's interesting. Okay. So then in addition to the Bobby Knight years, those were the Lee Corso years too, then on the football side. Is that right?
I think at the very end, it was Corso.
So we had another friend of mine that I went to IU with on a couple weeks ago, and I asked him, now, if you were a Purdue fan, maybe you didn't have quite the same reaction, but obviously the success we've had in the last 2 years, I'm just curious, like what your perspective was, having watched IU football for obviously longer than I had. I didn't become a fan until I went to the school because we moved around so much. I didn't live in Indiana until I went to Bloomington.
I told my kids I didn't think I would live long enough to see Indiana play in a Rose Bowl game, let alone win. When we were in high school, we lived about 45 minutes from Bloomington, and the players would get passes from our football coach to go to IU because they were just desperate to have anybody in the stadium. So yeah, we did that. And then I think going to games when I was in college was still something that a lot of people did. But my daughter, who attended Indiana, it was an afterthought to go to a football game. Basketball game, a whole different story, but certainly football was very, very lean.
Yeah, so I think we were talking before, your daughter was there the same time that I was there. We overlapped for a couple of years. And
right.
So, IU football was more about tailgating than it was about the actual football games. Yeah. And then you and I actually went to a bowl game together before they got good. So in January 2020, they were down in Jacksonville playing. And I re-looked up the stats of that game because I remember it was so heartbreaking that I forgot how bad it was, that we were up against Tennessee going in. I think there were like 5 minutes left and they scored twice in those last 5 minutes to beat us. And it just felt like the classic IU game, right?
So we lived in Chattanooga and we went to Indiana played Tennessee in the Peach Bowl. This was the 90 or 87 timeframe. And so we saw Indiana play in 2 bowl games. They played Auburn and Tennessee in the Peach Bowl. Lost both those games, of course.
I was surprised to learn Tennessee apparently got into some trouble. So they've actually vacated that win. So declaring that we won that game. Since Tennessee no longer has it on their record books. I don't think that's how that works, but whatever.
My son is a huge Tennessee fan, and I will tell him that they don't count that as a win any longer.
It's funny. My dad and I went and saw a Final Four game, and Louisville won that game, and then they got into some trouble, and so they vacated the win too. And we both were like, I swear we saw them win. I don't know how that works, but they definitely had the higher score at the end of the game. So anyway, okay. Jenny, is that enough IU football? Do you feel like we covered that sufficiently?
Plenty. That's my fill for the week. So let's jump into your college football officiating career and how you got into that. So did you play football growing up and that was of interest and it just kind of naturally progressed?
I played football in high school, and one of the clubs in high school was actually an officiating club. And so the football players officiated the Pop Warner ball, for lack of a better term, and basketball players officiated the basketball games for the elementary schools. So I did that, and my wife and I got married. We moved back home. And my ninth grade football coach, who was active in officiating at that time, I ran into him and he said, "Hey, you ought to think about doing this," kind of as a part-time deal. So sure enough, I did that. I actually refereed high school games with my freshman basketball coach, my freshman football coach, and another gentleman their age. And I was 24, 25 years old running around the Southern Indiana officiating football games with guys who had been my teachers. So that's kind of how it began.
And then how long does it take from sort of that, like the high school side, to get all the way into reffing college?
I got really lucky. This gentleman also worked small college football, and one of his crewmates, his job transferred him out of the state of Indiana. And I was 25, and the war in Vietnam hadn't been over that long. So there were guys coming back from Vietnam War going to college, playing small college football. So we were about the same age, and I was refereeing their games. So I just got pulled in very luckily and to work those small college football games. Like I said, when I was 25.
When you say small college, what do you mean by that?
Well, Division II, Division III.
Okay.
So, the FBS and FCS are the higher levels of college, and these are the small, typically liberal arts schools. Butler, which, played in a NCAA championship, also had a football team in Indianapolis. So it was those kind of schools, typically 4,000 or 5,000 student population.
Yeah, so you ended up reffing then for, a long time, like several decades by the time you were done,
yes.
Right? Yeah, because you've only been retired for I guess it's been more than a few years maybe now, but not very long, right?
From officiating?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is my third season, or this will be my third or fourth season coming up out of the booth now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Your college reffing experience mainly in the smaller D2, D3 schools?
I did that for 9 years, all based in Indiana. And we were assigned a national playoff game. At that time, we went to Omaha, Nebraska, of all places, and refereed a Division II playoff game. And then I started moving for work, and we moved to Chattanooga. And I thought, well, I'll just stop officiating. And my wife and I spent one fall going to craft shows, and I very quickly realized I needed to get back into officiating because I certainly couldn't go to craft shows every weekend the rest of my life. So I reached out to local high school.
Back into it,
right? Yeah. So I reached out to local guys who organized the high school officials and got involved with that. And you pass the state test in Tennessee, and I'd refereed a state championship game in Indiana and moved to Tennessee. And you say, well, I refereed a state championship game in Indiana. They're like, well, that doesn't mean anything. You got to start from the ground up. But fortunately, I moved up pretty quickly there and worked a state championship game in Chattanooga, and then moved to Memphis, Tennessee.
So you talk about having to pass a test, I think, in Tennessee. What does that test look like when you are getting into officiating?
It's typically 100 questions, and it's all situational plays. My wife used to read the practice test to me. So she learned all about the offense is always called Team A. The defense is always called Team B. So it would be a situation of that Team A had the ball 1st and 10 at the 25-yard line. Player 25 did this. Team B's player did this. Then what's the ruling? The result of the play was this. So let's say they ran it for a touchdown, but there was a holding on the offensive lineman. So those are the kind of situations they give you, and that you're supposed to then put, okay, well, the penalty would be enforced from the spot of the foul, and the down and distance would be replayed. And so it just goes through every situation in a football game, kicking, punting, return game, all sorts of things like that.
Is it multiple choice, or are you actually writing these responses?
No, you're writing the answer.
Wow. But are the rules different in Indiana and Tennessee, or they just want to make sure you fit their requirements?
Each year in high school, you took a test to requalify. So most of the states, with the exception, I think still today, of Texas, all use what are called National Federation rules, which is a high school governing body. Texas, though, because they're being Texas, they have their own sort of college rules, but they make certain adjustments in it. So it's really their own unique rule book. It's mostly like working a college game, but it's got some differences in it.
So then after going back to high school for a little bit in Tennessee, then how long did it take you to get back into like college again then?
Yeah, so we were in Chattanooga for 4 years, and then we moved to Memphis, and the person who ran the high school association was also a college football official. And because University of Memphis, or then Memphis State, was there, I was able to go for free and officiate their practices. And that's a way that people can kind of see what kind of skills you have and are you good enough to move up to the next level. I did that for, I think, a couple of years, and then they had an opening in that conference. And so this was 1992 that I moved up and started getting assigned games at the Division I level.
And then if I remember right, you repped a couple different conferences. I remember that you were in Conference USA for a little while, which I think that still exists. Like with all the realignment stuff, it's hard to keep track. But
well, Conference USA was where I was most of the time,
okay.
And I worked 2 years in the Big East. But yeah, the Conference USA that I started with is nowhere near Conference USA today. You know, they've gone to different places, and it's hard to keep track of all those different schools and what paths they've all been through.
Yeah.
How did you get assigned to games when you moved into Conference USA and even in high school and college?
Well, Conference USA, there was a supervisor who puts the crews together for each game and then makes a determination of what games within the conference schedule you're going to receive each year. I was going to say that in high school, we essentially reached out to schools on our own and booked games. And we had a school who was in our high school's conference, and they had assigned us to our hometown school's game against them. And I reached back out to the athletic director when I got the assignment. And I said, now, you know, we live in Columbus and Columbus is playing Jeffersonville. He goes, yes, they accuse our officials of cheating. So I'm intentionally getting you guys to work that game so they can't complain about the officials.
That's funny. That's interesting. I mean, I guess it's interesting that like you were responsible for like booking your own, that there wasn't like a process, right? That this was just sort of willy-nilly.
Yeah, exactly. In Tennessee, it was different. In Tennessee, they had assigning supervisors, and very similar to college. The supervisor would put the crews together and then put your schedule together. And I'm sure Indiana doesn't do that any longer.
So that's interesting that you bring up refs accused of cheating. How does bias play into this? Because you have teams that you like, but obviously you can't ref those teams. Or do they ask you these questions before you game?
When Indiana began to play some of the Conference USA schools late in my career, mostly when I was in replay, that the supervisor asks you, what schools have you been affiliated with? If you're in business, do you have a business working relationship with any schools within our conference? So I knew that Indiana was on the schedule. And I said, I don't want to be the replay official on any Indiana games. But at the same time, I would go as a technical advisor. So I would critique the on-field officials and have no role in the actual administration of the game. So I was able to do that a couple of times, but you clearly want to stay away from, at least I wanted to stay away from anything that had to do with Indiana or Tennessee. My son went there, and, you know, so those kind of things would have been difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
I think there's natural bias when you've been rooting for them.
Yeah. So what does training look like, both, I think, from like the actual game part of it and then like physical training? Because obviously, at least when you were on the field, I mean, you're obviously running up and down, so you have to be in good shape. Is there training for you to stay in shape? And then what does it look like for the actually games?
The physical side, you're expected to stay in shape, and they would have some during the preseason clinic, they would have on-field physical activity that you're being measured. It wasn't, you know, like the SEC, for example, have all their officials run 12-minute run, and then depending on your age, you're expected to go so far. So, you know, you might, if you're 25 to 40, you might be expected to run 1.5 miles in 12 minutes. There are in-person clinics twice with Conference USA. It was twice a year, once in the spring and then once this time of year, right before the season began. And then as I got into replay, video calls just like this have become more and more a part of the training. And they actually, on a national level, we would get maybe 20 or 30 people from across the country on a call, and they would have plays that they would put up on the screen. And certain people then would go through the steps that you would to review a play, for example, and you get critiqued by the people on the call, and there's a national supervisor who heads that up. So a lot more, as technology has improved, a lot more of that sort of training. And it's used to get almost an old fashioned VCR tape that you couldn't stop and start and slow down. And that's what you saw. But now it's all video and lots of video exercise to develop certain skills.
And then I've heard that referees get graded. I don't know if that's after every game or like a season to sort of, I'm assuming that helps decide, do you get to keep going next year?
It helps. That's true. And every position gets graded. And after I came off the field, I did that as part of the replay process for a while. And so that happens. And then in Conference USA's case, the game tape went to one of four. Some were still active and others were retired NFL officials. They would review the entire game and then provide a written critique on the calls that you made, the calls that you didn't make. And so that became part of our Friday night exercise. So if we had a Saturday game, arrive at the hotel and have about a 2-hour meeting, which included review of last week's game, lots of video. We'd have a written test. One person might be responsible to do one section of the rule book each week just to keep things fresh. But yeah, that's where all the video critiquing came back around. And then, so that did determine whether you got a bowl game or not. And then, whether you got rehired the next year, because all the officials are independent contractors and work on a year-to-year basis.
Yeah. So I guess then, like, during a game, it seems like there'd be a lot of communication between the officials. So like in big rivalry games, when it's super loud, like how much is that impacting you? Like how loud is it on the field? And is that something you would have to like kind of have a plan for going into the game to think about?
It is really loud. When I started, there was no O2O, what they consider official to official communication, which you see now on all the officials, both in college and in the pros. Earpiece, microphone, so they can communicate using that within the crew. A lot of times it's, all right, what was the number of the person who committed the foul? What was the foul? It might be, there's a lot of warning that takes place, especially on the sidelines. So you might tell the coach, hey, you guys got to get back on your sideline, or a defensive lineman lining up across the football, the neutral zone is what they call it. But before you throw that flag, you're going to want to give them fair warning that you got to back up. Or wide receivers not up on the line of scrimmage, you guys need to get up on the line, because it's a rule. But if the guy's out there and the defender is across from him, it's like, I don't know what your advantage you're gaining is, but that's the kind of communication that takes place. And then on, when there's a penalty, it seems like every crew I was on, there was another guy who was kind of a non-biased rules expert, so he could stand outside of the fray and be sure that we weren't misenforcing a penalty. Kind of the calmer mind standing out there and listening to what's going on, and then if we're getting it right, just walk away. Or if we needed to rethink something before we enforce the penalty, he'd jump in. And just different people with different crews, but it seems like every crew has somebody like that assigned to the crew.
So how big is the crew?
Today, it's 8 people on the field. There are 8 officials on the field. The college has 8. The pros have only 7. I don't know why. And then now the people in the replay booth, there are 2 or 3 of those, depending on the Power 4 conferences, 3 people in the replay booth, and the smaller conferences just have 2. But then there's communication from the press box down to the officials on the field. You're part of that same communication that the officials are using on the field. So you can weigh in now to correct, let's say a kick went out of bounds and the crew has just missed it by 10 or 15 yards. The people in the booth can say, hey, the ball needs to be on the 42-yard line. And they'll just accept that. It's smooth. They don't stop the game. They just put it where it belongs and move on. So there's that kind of communication. And certainly when I started, none of that was available. And you're just kind of hung out there, and it was what you said it was.
What do you think surprised you the most when you started refereeing, maybe at the college level, right? Was there something either about the fans, or I'm always surprised at how much communication there is, not just in calling the penalties, but like what you were talking about, where the refs are trying to help the players out, not in an unfair way. Right. It's just like, let's not call stupid, fouls if we don't have to, right? People are here to watch football, not to watch flags get thrown. So I'm curious if there was something that surprised you, particularly at the college level.
Well, I think what surprised me, and then kind of magically 2 or 3 years down the road, was not an issue, but it was how much faster the game was from high school to college. Because, in high school, there's maybe one player in a game that maybe is a Division I player, or 2 or 3 if it's a really, good football program. But then, in college, there's 22, and they're all just bigger and faster. So that was probably the thing that initially was intimidating. And then, I don't know, like I say, 2 or 3 years into officiating at the college level, it was like everything slowed down. You hear players talking about that. It was the same sort of sense for me that it just slowed down, and all of a sudden you don't feel like you're going at breakneck speed, and much more comfortable. And I think you do a much better job because you're not worried about what you're doing. You do that naturally, and you may have better judgment on calls.
You talk about it going fast when you first get into it. Was that a physical training that you had to do to keep up, or was it more just like making sure you saw the field and saw all the plays that were happening?
I think it was probably a little bit of both, but one of our supervisors is an active NFL referee and very insistent on what we call mechanics, and that's where each official stands to start the play and then what initial movement they should have to be sure that they're in position to make a call. And so that was one of the basic training things that he did, as well as just get us to back up away from the play so that you had a wider range to be able to see what was going on without moving. You're far enough back, not out of the play completely, but you're far enough back that you can watch what's going on without physically moving. And that was just really helpful. And like you say, you're in better position to make the call.
What do you think fans misconstrue about referees? I mean, I'm sure, that they're always on the other team's side, but like, are there legitimate things you think the fans just don't get?
One of the difficult things I think is everyone watches football games on Sunday and they want to take those rules to a Saturday college game, and they're not the same. I think they feel like officials have an agenda, and trust me, we worked in Ohio State. Central Florida played at Ohio State. I think we called 7 fouls the entire game. In the paper the next morning, we got a positive critique from Columbus Dispatch about the officials just weren't even part of the game. And that was kind of the biggest compliment you could have. Not that, you made this great call, but that we were just pretty much invisible to the game.
I thought you were going to say that the Ohio State fans loved it and the Central Florida fans hated it.
I'm sure you got booed along the way in different games because the refs don't always get a good rap, to Beth's point. How did it feel to kind of feel like you had everyone against you?
You get booed a lot, and most of the time you're right, so you just kind of let it fall off your shoulder. I think the hardest thing is when you've made a mistake that you can't correct, and then you have to live with that for the next, half of the game or whatever the time frame is. And put that out of your mind and get focused back on what the play is at hand. Because the officials all make mistakes, and you've made a mistake. And I think one of the hardest things to do is not try to overcompensate to make up for the mistake that you already made, but rather, just forget about it and go ahead and do your job with kind of taking that out of your mind.
Yeah, that's interesting, because sometimes watching basketball where I think, like the fouls are maybe called more often, or I don't know, like it feels different. There's times where you're like, oh, that's a catch up foul, right? Like you think they know they got the first one wrong. So they're like kind of fixing it a little bit. So to your point, like, is that just an instinct that you want to do that? You just have to actively try not to, because that doesn't actually make sense. I think too, like in football, the fouls aren't all equal. Whereas maybe in basketball, if the thing was like, well, they got 2 free throws, I'm gonna let the other team have 2 free throws. And then we're kind of like, we net it out. But football is like, because of position on the field, just doesn't feel like you can do that.
No, well, you can. I think the difficult thing about football is when the foul occurs, the play continues. In basketball, when the foul occurs, play stops.
Yeah.
And, quite frankly, I think the officials feel like most of the fans don't know what should or shouldn't be called in many cases. So you just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, okay, well, that's fine. Move on. I mean, that's all you can do, really.
I often joke that like even on my worst day at work, nobody boos me, but you can't say that. You've probably been booed by a lot of people.
I personally love referees, especially my favorite like NBA person is Steve Javie, the instant replay. He used to be a ref, and he did all the NBA Finals games. And I love him when he comes on and gives his analysis in the instant replay booth. Now, people always make fun of me, but I'm probably the only person that knows a ref's name. Going back to big rivalries, what was the biggest rivalry game that you can think back to reffing?
Well, it's sort of interesting because, for example, Cincinnati and Louisville played for a keg of nails. I don't know why it was called a keg of nails, but the two schools were close together. And those are fun games. Southern Miss and Memphis had rivalries going on. And I just think everybody gets excited about those rivalry games. And you just want to be sure you don't make any mistakes. So you're kind of a heightened sense of what's going on. You're aware of the importance of the game. We had a game at the old Miami, the old Orange Bowl. Miami and Louisville played there, and it was a nail biter down to the end. The place was full, and that was a big deal because it was on Thursday night national TV. It was the only game that was being played on ESPN. That was the game that was played, and it was exciting. Went down to the closing minute. So those are the ones you look back and you feel really good about having worked. I worked conference championship games, which are more important than a regular game because there's so much you get a trophy that says they were the conference champion. And I think you just appreciate the opportunity to do it. And as a result, you try and, give it your best performance.
Then at some point you moved into the replay booth. So I'm assuming that is probably like a little bit of a challenging transition because I'm sure as officials on the field, you think you never got it wrong. And the replay guy is the one who's telling you did get it wrong. So is it hard to go from being the guy on the field to being the guy that you probably were a little annoyed by in the booth, and now you're that guy?
I think because I started in college football without replay, and replay then began to evolve. And at first, you were self-conscious. You were going to be unhappy that somebody overruled you. And as replays become more and more accepted and just part of the game, the whole concept of let's just get it right is what everybody thinks about. It used to be that you would make a call and you would err on the side of, for example, if it was a low ball, you would err on the side of making it incomplete. But now with replay, you err on the side of making it complete on the field because you know that replay can fix it. So officials today officiate to replay within those kind of parameters of knowing, okay, replay can fix this, replay can't fix this. So I'm going to err on the side of allowing to make the call that replay can fix. And that's a whole mindset that the officials today have developed that was really difficult for me transitioning from no replay to replay. And the guys that are officiating today have had replay. That's all they know. So it's been a change in philosophy on a lot of different things. Pass fumble, like by the quarterback, when the ball's back here and is the ball coming forward? Well, now you err that it's a fumble because if you rule it a pass and they can't fix that and it turns out to be a fumble, there's certain things that they can or can't fix. So that's, like I say, a real big change in the way that guys on the field handle those plays.
So did you enjoy being up in the booth then when you transitioned to that?
It allowed me to stay involved in officiating. It was not nearly as much pressure as, I'll take that back. The pressure that I felt before game when I was on the field, as soon as the ball kicked off, it kind of reduced. In replay, when the ball kicked off, now you've got to be a heightened alertness, and it was tense because you don't know whether you're going to stop the game or not stop the game. And it was just kind of a complete reversal of being on the field, kind of getting into the groove versus being on in replay and trying to make that decision. Well, is this big enough to stop the game or is it not? And that sort of thing. So I way preferred being on the field versus being in the booth.
So how does that work? Like making the decision to replay, to like you talked about, like stop the game. Is it just pure judgment? I think you said there's more than one replay official. So is it like a consensus or?
Well, there's not much consensus, but somebody might be able to provide you, because the officials in the booth today have probably a 40-inch monitor that's cut up into 12 small pictures. So they've got all the cameras from the game that are all available to them. So what you have to do in the time between the end of the play and the ball snapping for the next play is make a decision. Is this enough information I should stop the game? And so, for example, down and distance makes a big difference. If you have a play on first down and it gains 2 yards and maybe the runner stepped out of bounds 1 yard versus 2 yards downfield, you just let it go. On the other hand, if that same event occurs on 3rd and 1, well, now all of a sudden it's a huge play, even though it's the same exact play, but down and distance makes a big difference. So there's this whole set of criteria that replay has at their disposal. And that's one of the things that they really drill down on is this reviewable? What are the steps in the review? So, you've got correct the play, but then you've also got to decide, can I put time back on the clock? Was the clock running? Is the clock stop? Is it ruled a completed pass on the field incomplete in replay, which means rather than have a running clock, you have a stop clock. And so there's all those variables that come into play. But any scoring play is reviewable. Anything having to do with a first down pretty much is reviewable. The game's 35-7 in the fourth quarter. Probably nothing's reviewable because everybody agrees they want to get the game over with.
Is there like a certain like a guideline for how long it should take you from when you say like, hey, we're going to stop the game to like, hey, we need to keep things moving here?
They thought that if you took longer than 2 minutes, and this is when I was, last time I was in the booth, if you couldn't make a decision in 2 minutes, you need to go with the ruling on the field. So that was sort of but you've seen some big plays at the end of a lot of SEC games. They had one play where they had an interception and then a last second play where they're making backward passes. The next player, kind of that rugby style play. And then they have to decide if the team ended up scoring was one of those many backward passes forward. So under those circumstances, they kind of say, well, you got to take whatever time it's going to take to look at every single one of those backward passes to be sure none of them were forward, because if they were, that was the end of the play. So those circumstances, they give you a lot more time.
Do you have a favorite coach that you ever got to officiate, either because he was funny or like, I don't know, something about him you liked?
I tell you, Steve Logan was a coach at East Carolina for a long time, and he was the quietest guy. If the ball was at the 20-yard line, he would be at the opposite 20-yard line kneeling. I mean, he almost never said a word to you. He wasn't close to the action. And then you've had other coaches that, as my wife and kids would say, they would see me having a conversation during a game with one of the coaches, and they said, well, we've seen Dad give that last look to us the same way look he's given to the coaches. And lots of times you go, well, Coach, if it happened the way you said it did, we were wrong. And you just have to walk away from it.
Just walk away.
Yeah.
Would fans be surprised at the conversations happening between coaches and referees? Or is it what you think it is, right?
I think over time, I got to the point where I was more willing to be more demonstrative towards coaches than I had originally. Originally, I didn't want to be confrontational at all. And, I had a coach at Marshall, and he continued to ask me to come over and explain a call, and then he would complain about how awful we were doing each play. And about the third time I went over there, and he started this. I said, Coach, I'm not going to come over here for you to tell me what a horrible job we're doing. I said it in more colorful language than that, and walked away from him. And the next time out, he's like, Randy, come here. I'm really sorry. So, some of it's a relationship you develop and figure out how far you can go with these guys. And
did you ever, I'm sure you did, but maybe what was the funniest, where somebody said something to you, either a player or a coach, that you just like flat out laughed out loud, that you were like, I cannot believe you just said that?
One of the things I think was memorable, at least, we worked a game that they delayed the start until 1 minute before midnight. And at 3:30 a.m., we've taken the final TV timeout. And one of the players on one of the teams goes, what are we doing? I said, well, it's TV. We're taking the last TV timeout. He goes, people in Hawaii aren't even watching this game.
What do you think is the weirdest thing you've ever seen happen on a football field? Other than, I guess, maybe finishing a game at 3:30 a.m. That's pretty weird.
Right. Yeah. My goodness. We had West Virginia and Marshall, and all of a sudden a fan comes out of the stands and grabs one of the officials' hats off of his head. And we were standing pretty close together when this happened. He goes, that guy just stole my hat. Well, so he just ended up running around in the middle of the football field, and then he realized, I don't know what I'm doing now that I'm out here. And sure enough, he gets tackled by about 3 security people and hauled off the field. But the guy goes, he did get my hat. The other thing that we laughed about was we had a game at Memphis, and as we were leaving the stadium, there was a mother with her 10-year-old son. It was kind of alleged that they were looking down on the officials, and we look up, and this 10-year-old is flipping us off. The guy, one of the guys from Memphis said, well, Randy, you finally made it to big time football. You got 10-year-olds flipping you off. Yeah.
It's funny. I listened to some podcasts with Philadelphia Eagles fans and players, and that's definitely that's just normal in Philadelphia. They talk about that all the time, that it's a real fan when the 10-year-old kid has been taught, right?
Right.
All the
Hold
things
his mother's
that football
hand.
fans say. Do you think, this one's probably a hard question just because you officiated for so long, but do you think you watch games differently with that, the lens of being a former official than just being a fan?
Yeah, I do. And I know people have commented on that. You sort of look at every game as if you're still the official rather than, where's the ball and what's it doing.
Yeah.
And it was certainly when I was on the field, you felt like there was some training involved in that situation. So rather than you try and put yourself in the position of an official, but I think your dad would say that, yeah, there's lots of times where Randy called the penalty before the announcers called the penalty. But, just because I've seen so much of that.
Yeah, that's funny. Do you have a favorite stadium that you ever officiated in, or a favorite game
We
maybe?
were,
I know you talked about some of the fun ones, but
yeah, well, probably the most emotional game we had Army played at UAB the first weekend after 9/11. And we're standing there on the sideline as the teams are running on the field, and Army runs out carrying, the American flag. And the guy and I are standing there, and we both are just really emotional because it was like these kids, we think about them playing football normally, but then there was such a realization after 9/11 that next spring, they're going to be out protecting our country. So
yeah.
that was very emotional. And then we went to Army actually at West Point later that season, and they had snipers in the stadium. We had the Sun Bowl game that same year, and the same thing was true because it's in El Paso and it's right on the Mexican border. And at that time, nobody really knew what to expect and what was the next thing that was going to happen. But yeah, you had snipers up in the mountains overlooking the stadium, and yeah, those are certainly memories that we had.
Yeah, it kind of takes it from just being a football game to like a little
Right.
bit more
Yeah,
meaning, which
different perspective.
yeah. Is there a
hmm
rule that you would eliminate, like as an official, one that you just hated having to call?
Well, they've gone back and forth so many times about keeping their shirt tails tucked in. That
Oh,
used
I
to
didn't
be a
realize that was a
big.
thing.
Oh my goodness, yeah. There was a time when you were supposed to charge a team a timeout if their players didn't keep their shirt tails tucked in.
Oh, you're
So
kidding me.
we all just ignored that completely because it's like, well, that's not part of the game. If you want their shirt tails tucked in, somebody needs to police that, not us. And there was some, yeah, but I think those kinds of things that you think, well, why are we? That has nothing to do with a football game.
Yeah, that's a very dress code feels like a pretty silly rule to have
Mm.
officials weighing in on,
But
right?
in the NFL, they have someone who walks around on the field before the game and writes down numbers of players who are non-compliant in their uniform, and then they get a fine on Mondays. So that's how
Yeah,
the
which I would say
NFL
they're getting
works.
paid, although I guess,
Yeah,
yeah, college they're getting paid now too. So I guess it's a different
yeah.
set of circumstances. Yeah, that's interesting.
If someone is interested in getting into refereeing, what is the best way to go about that nowadays?
I think still everybody needs to start at the local level. There's a huge demand. That'll be my 10-second commercial for officiating. Huge, huge, huge shortage of youth officials. And that's where most everyone cuts their teeth initially is with moms and dads standing right behind you on a field that there's 6 games going on. Kind of like you think about soccer games. Well, football's the same way. But any state organization, they can put you in touch with people on a local basis. Like I live in Jacksonville, so the people in Jacksonville who there's just, like I said, there's tons and tons of need for that kind of help. And that's kind of where you get started, and you don't make a lot of money, but you kind of cut your teeth on doing that. And all the local communities have training programs of some sort available. Like I know in Jacksonville, there's a number of groups that meet, like on Monday nights throughout the football season. And they have a lot of college officials, but they also do the same thing for high school associations. And that's where the initial training takes place.
Yeah, I think along with your commercial for becoming a referee, we should probably make a commercial for parents behaving themselves, because I'm sure that is a huge deterrent these days from people wanting to go. To your point, if you're doing middle school or junior high or whatever, you're not making any money, but you're taking an awful lot of heat from some pretty crazy parents. So if people
Yeah.
would just behave themselves, there probably would not be such a big referee shortage if I had to guess.
Well, and you read all the time now about some official being physically accosted at a high school game. And certainly that discourages a lot of people
Yeah.
from wanting to get into this vocation because they don't want to put their physical life in jeopardy. We had a guy whose dad was a very successful college official. His son got into high school officiating, and it would have been on a, kind of a rocket ship because he had played in college, and just after not even a year said, "Dad, I don't want to do this. It's belittling. I don't want to get yelled at. I just don't want to do it." So that's why that's a big part of the problem today.
Yeah, that's a shame. Well, are you looking forward to college and NFL getting started? We're almost in August, so it'll be pretty soon
We are, yeah.
before.
All the NFL training camps have started, and about the only thing I do now is fantasy football. So
Yeah. I think my dad told me that you couldn't do fantasy football when you were a ref, even if it was you were ref in college and you would have been in for
correct,
NFL, that they still wouldn't let you do that because it was
right?
gambling.
Yeah, yeah. I think we put in $50. So that's. But yeah, I couldn't have a team until after I retired.
So I do have to ask, who's your top fantasy pick then?
Well, I tell you what, I am such a bad picker that I let auto draft do my picking, but I just arrange the position. So, I want running backs. I don't get a quarterback too soon, but I'm not very good on doing all the research. I just kind of like moving the players around and playing the chess piece.
My dad's
Okay.
actually the commissioner for, oh, is he still the commissioner or he's just
Uh-huh.
a participant now?
No, he's
Yeah,
the
he's the
commissioner.
commissioner for their
Yep.
league. He's also won a few times, which I find highly suspicious.
I think what happened is it used to be just all the retired group, and then he's let some younger people in, and it's kind of shifted his ability to be the smartest guy. Some of the people I don't think paid a lot of close attention to it. That's fun. It gives you something to talk about on Sundays.
Yeah, I was surprised he turned into such a fantasy football guy because, watching him like as I grew up, I mean, he just didn't have time for that. But then when he retired, he had nothing but time. And my dad is very
Mm-hmm.
organized. And so there are spreadsheets. And so in retrospect, I should have realized this is what he would look like in fantasy football, right?
Yep.
This was not a casual event. So
Exactly.
So I was watching a video today in regards to how a group that played fantasy football was going to draft this year and what the order would be for how they would draft. They actually got on a children's slide on a little car with wheels and slid down the slide, and they were trying to see how far they could go. And whoever went the longest, that was their order for draft picks. So there you go. There's an idea for your dad.
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure that's what's happening next.
Ours isn't that sophisticated.
Right. Well, Randy, thank you so much for coming on. I will watch college football differently now that I have a college ref's perspective.
All right. Well, I hope you got something useful here.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting. It's always interesting to learn things that, even though like we've met a bunch of times, I've never asked you about being a referee. So it's interesting
Right.
to hear sort of
Yep.
your experience. I've heard from my dad, obviously, some of your stories, but it was definitely interesting to hear it from you. So we appreciate you coming on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bet.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode. And if you've liked what you've heard and you've stuck with us this far, we would love for you to subscribe. We are on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We hope to see you next week.